All right, here we are. It is 9 o'clock. We are right at the top of the hour, so we're going to jump right in. If this is your first time with us today, I am Tony Best, Chief Human Performance Officer at Aduro, and I have with me Christine McHugh, my brilliant and wonderful friend with a long history from Starbucks and consulting with smaller companies and leading in all different sizes of organizations. So like I said last week, we bring over 4 decades of leadership to this conversation. And we don't have all of the answers because this is a global pandemic and things are changing rapidly. So we're all figuring this out together. And we know that you're all bombarded on a regular basis right now with webinars that you can watch with 5 tips and 3 tricks and whatever's coming at you. So we've designed this intentionally to be organic and without slides. So if you have Zoom fatigue or video conferencing fatigue, you are welcome to just listen to us. You're not missing any slides if you're not seeing them because we don't have any. And we'll just be having some organic conversation about leadership topics that are coming up in our networks. And today we're going to talk about leadership. But Christine, thank you for being with me again today. It's always delightful to have conversations with you, and I'm really excited to be talking about leadership communication today. Anything you want to add in to how this is going to work before we get started?
No, I think that's great. I'm really excited, and we're looking forward to encouraging some two-way dialogue. So we'll be spending a little bit of time sharing some of the things that we've heard, learned, or experienced as leaders or from leaders, and then really want to hear from all of you what's on your mind, what's been successful, and maybe what challenges you're being faced with. So as Tony said, that's the organic nature of it. Yeah, so that's it.
Absolutely, and thank you for that too. For everybody who's on, you are probably familiar with the chat function in Zoom. If you've never used the Q&A function, I highly encourage you to use the Q&A function for questions about leadership communication today. It's actually just easier to follow when it's in that Q&A function, but we'll also check in on the chat too and see what questions are coming up. So don't hesitate to send in your questions as they arise, and we will get to them. So communication. All right, so communication in leadership is always important, but as we were talking about earlier, leaders are getting a crash course in it right now, right? So either they're doing it well, or not doing it at all, and the results of that are showing up. So talk to me, Christine, about communication as leaders, and why is it important always, and especially now?
I think, always is because it's an opportunity to cast the vision, provide clarity on direction, celebrate accomplishments. And I have a saying, if you don't provide the information to people, they'll fill in the gaps on their own. And that can be a lot more dangerous, whether that is in day-to-day, quote unquote, normal business operations, but especially in a time of crisis. So the worst thing that could happen by not having frequent enough communication or effective communication is that team members will make up what's actually happening in stories, and that can cause distractions and stress and impact productivity. So it is super important. And my experience has been through this pandemic or through other business crises I've been a part of, is that you need to double down on communication, particularly as it relates to the transparency, the urgency, the frequency, and the empathy. I think those are the 4 points. So those should always be part of any leader's communication strategy and approach. But when you get in a time like this, it's even, transparency is critical. Urgency is critical. Frequency, different methods, is critical. And empathy is probably one of the highest and most important things to happen to really try and meet people where they're at. So I probably expanded on the answer to your question, but that's why leadership communication is super important, not just in general, but especially during times of crisis.
Absolutely. And we were talking earlier, but before we went live here, just about times of crisis that you experienced at Starbucks and having those every morning meetings, which we're doing right now at Aduro. Things are changing so quickly. We have to be staying on top of those things. And so, when you think about transparency, as a leader in communication, I think, you know, we're communicating on an everyday basis, and we want to keep our employees up to date on what's going on, be real with them. And this is all part of this transparency piece. How do you know what to communicate out and what is held within your leadership team?
That's a really good question. I think, you know, I saw this article on Harvard Business Review. It wasn't actually an article, it was just a chart about like overcoming your instincts so you can lead effectively during a time of crisis. And it said, instinctively, leaders, when faced with uncertainty, downplay the threat and withhold bad news. And in a time of crisis, they need to communicate with transparency. So I guess what I would say is, you know, as a leader during time of crisis, is you need not be afraid to share bad news, but also create a level of optimism with a vision, as much as the optimism can serve the organization. The downside of being, I guess it's like transparency has a positive aspect and content also a part where things aren't always going great. And you got to find the right balance for your organization and your culture where you're not creating so much potential fear, but you're not making it too sunshiny and happy, so that people aren't have a realistic view of what's happening. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I do think you need to look at it, how it ties to your company's kind of values, your mission, your vision, and find the right balance. And to communicate, you know, use facts the best that you can, you know, in terms of that they exist, to help substantiate whatever it is you're communicating. What would you add?
Yeah, I think you did answer it, and I think, you know, some of the key points when I think of transparency is in a time like this, if you're holding back the negative things that are happening, the way that circumstances are affecting your business or the team, ultimately people know at some level, and like you said, if you don't communicate it, people will fill in the gaps. And so it's an opportunity to build trust. It's an opportunity to build trust just in that you are communicating what's going on, what the impact is on the company, on the team. And then also I would just add in there that you mentioned facts, like stick with the facts. This is what's happening, this is the impact of it, but also how we're making decisions about it. You know, if you share with people how we're thinking about things and how we're making decisions as we move through this difficult time, then it gives people confidence in that we are really being thoughtful about the decisions that we're making. And we're telling you how we're making those decisions so that you can be on board with it and follow along. And it gives you a little more certainty in how we're handling it, which certainty is not readily available right now, right? And so the more certainty you can provide to people, the more comfort and groundedness it's going to give them, and just being able to go ahead and do their everyday tasks that they still have to do. So yeah.
Yeah, you make me think too, as part of that, I think that's a really great point about how we're making decisions, is people often need that context and the why, right? And so I think, how does that play into that too in those communications? Here's the decisions, here's why we made the decision, here's how we made it, here's why we made the decision that we made, just so people can understand the context of that. I think that that's an important element to add.
Mm-hmm. We have multiple communications that are going out each week to the company. Our chief operating officer sends out a weekly communication to people. And one of the things that I love that he does, it's, you know, it's the facts. It's like, hey, here's what's happening. You know, here's how things are changing. Here's how we're handling it. But he also, because it's part of his personality, I think personal style and communication, you know, your authenticity comes through and you have to use it. And one of the things that he always does is brings humor into the conversation. And it, you know, bringing humor into that conversation, even in an email, can interrupt people's patterns as far as like how they're thinking about the situation, create an openness to receive new information, and also just kind of set people at ease that, yeah, it's a tough time. We're all going through this, but it's okay to laugh. You know, it's okay to take a step back and just look at the bigger picture, and doing so can help you see more clearly. So I think even in those communications, as we're being transparent and clear, it's also important to be real and authentic, and you know, give people something sturdy to connect to. How do you think about, you know, as we are communicating, you talked about urgency, and so you know, say more just about this topic of urgency, and why it's important, and how to capitalize even on the importance of urgency during this time.
Yeah, I think, oftentimes as leaders, we want to be very thoughtful in our decision making, thoughtful in what we communicate, the tonality of our messages, the content of our messages. Um, and that deliberativeness is to really ensure that the message that we are communicating is going to have the desired impact, right? So it can be really uncomfortable if we are to move to a direction where we're actually urgent in our communication. And by that, I mean likely going forward sometimes without having an opportunity to really think through all the details and vet, and yes, be fact-based, of course, but like to be able to communicate urgently, not wait for the next news cycle, potentially depending on what it is, or wait for the next planned calm because it might be too late. I think that is one aspect of urgency, as well as when it's appropriate, expressing urgency within the message itself. That here's what we're doing, why we're doing, why we need to do it now, or why we not need to do it now. I think that is really critical because urgency, people do respond to that. And when I say urgency, I don't necessarily mean, your hair is on fire and that, it's that kind of frenetic urgency, because I think urgency can also have an intensity about it. But oftentimes employees respond to a level of intensity that comes with urgency. And if you take too much of a step back sometimes, then they may just, assume that the message is kind of wait things out a little bit. So I think it's important both in the frequency of the communications and determining what to wait for, what not to wait for. I think it's how the message is communicated. Are you conveying a sense of urgency for your team to do something or not do something? And then, because that will actually propel them into action. And then I would also add that it's just knowing how people are going to internalize that and where are they going to potentially take that, and being mindful of that. So those are a couple of things that come to mind, but it might be contradictory to how we have customarily communicated as leaders, which oftentimes there might be a script or a rehearsal or a review, one more review of a memo before it went out. And sometimes you just need to press send because in an hour it may be too late. So there's just a couple of thoughts.
I love that. And I think, something that is really coming up right now is just the importance of people having information in their hands. And if we are leading courageously, part of courageous leadership is the vulnerability of not always getting it right, of having to come back and say, you know what, that's what we said yesterday, but things are changing quickly, and now this is where we are today. If you're just open with those things, the change and the being adaptable to the environment and keeping people up to date about how you're responding is important. I think, you also talked about the impact though, which is we're really talking about leader communication to the people that you lead. But it makes me think of how much communication we have coming at us right now from everywhere. We're getting emails from anyone we have ever done business with right now. Even if it was one time, we shopped in their store one time or we visited their website one time, we're getting emails daily about what their COVID response is. And so, after a while, you start to get immune to those and just start hitting delete. And because of all that communication that's coming from everywhere, it's so important as leaders that the communication we put out is impactful, that it's not just communicating for the sake of communicating. So I'm not sure how many leaders are even thinking about how much is coming in at people from everywhere when they're thinking about their own communication to their teams or even out to their customers. Anything you would add there?
Yeah, it definitely has been personally overwhelming for me. And I don't even have a direct reporting team right now. I have clients, but I don't have a direct reporting team, but I am seeing how it's impacting my clients and then also me personally with all the things that are going on. And I think as leaders, finding the right balance of what's like formal and structured in your communications with the informal and spontaneous. And so, for example, what that could look like is, Tony, you mentioned you're doing, weekly stand-ups or huddles with your team, or daily stand-ups or huddles with your team. I imagine you're using that forum to decide what, if anything, additional you might need to communicate out in more depth, or how you want to get input in. And that established frequency gives people some sense of reliability because of the consistency with which you're doing that, and they can count on it. And the informal and spontaneous check-ins to see how individuals might be doing, how they're feeling, what do they need, I think is also important as well. And that doesn't have to be a calendared thing. Actually, it probably shouldn't be a calendared thing. Just a few random check-ins with people to see, what problems they need help solving, whether it's a text, a call, or a check-in. A friend of mine, she's actually over in China, and she's the CEO of a retailer over there. And so they're ahead of us in terms of what they've gone through and what they've come out of. But she's a big believer of tangible check-ins. And so personal check-ins with people. So she would, on occasion, surprise them with a handwritten note in the mail. She even sent them all each a box of oranges and her leadership team. So that's communication, right? That's a connection point with your employees in addition to the business meetings that she was having. So I think finding that right balance of what your team needs and what your organization's needs of the formal structured with the informal spontaneous is going to be a good blend to be able in terms of the communication strategy.
I agree. This ties into a question that we got that came in from Joe Ivy. How do you gauge what medium should be used for news to be shared? More important, Zoom or personal reach out, less important, email? How do you think about it? And, I think there's some things that we've experimented with and things that we've just learned. We have a weekly all company meeting on Fridays where we share important information we think everyone should hear. When we're sending out our weekly communication to the entire company, we are sending that out via email because that's where people spend a lot of time in their email box. So they're going there. When we're sending out inspirational messages, we have some channels in Microsoft Teams where we're sending those things out. People can choose whether or not to get those alerts. They can choose to go in there and look for inspiration when they're looking for it. And then, just in terms of personal reach out, we're sending direct chats, we're making phone calls. I think part of that too is knowing your audience and tailoring that to the individual. So I have some people that it's always on video because they really need to see faces. Some people are just exhausted by Zoom and, they're choosing to use phone or even just chat. And so I think there's some ways of just finding how does your team really receive information best, and communicating through those channels and knowing when they're going to receive the really important information, where is that going to be received, sticking to those and creating a pattern of it so people know where to find the information, I think is really important. And that dovetails into this conversation about when you're checking in with people. I think something that is really, really important. I do check-ins inside of my team, outside of my team on a regular basis. I check on the quiet ones a lot, the ones that you don't always know how they're feeling, reaching out and just saying, how are you doing? Those kinds of check-ins. I think the people that we sometimes forget to check in on are the high performers that always appear like they have it all together. And I think that this is one of the most important things that leaders can do right now is not neglect your high performers that always appear like they have it all together. I have a couple of examples of people that I talked to last week. These both happen to be working moms who are now working at home with their kids, and they know people don't necessarily think to check in with them because they're the people they go to when they need when they need support and guidance and answers and those sorts of things. And so no one's checking in on their well-being. They're still going to them for support and their well-being. And these same people have a hard time asking for help or saying like, I can't get it all done. And so I really think as leaders in communicating to your people, you know, don't forget to check in with those high performers that always look like they have it together. They might be the ones that need the most support right now. Any thoughts to add there, Christine?
No, I think it's like you said, it's customizing to the organization, but also recognizing the individual and what their needs
Mm-hmm.
are. And not necessarily, to your point, make assumptions that you know, everybody's doing okay, or the people who totally have it together might not right now and need a little extra support. So I think that's where the empathy comes into play. I mentioned transparency, urgency, frequency, and empathy. And taking the time for those personal, informal connections is an opportunity to lead with empathy and connect with people to see where they're at. So.
I think, you know, when you talk about leading with empathy too, there's, we're on, at least if everyone's working from home, we are on video chats all day long. And I've noticed I'm a person that typically is really, really present with people. And sometimes it's hard when you've been on Zoom calls all day long to get into that next call and be really present. And so this is like a takeaway for all leaders that are listening, is that you know, you have to make sure that you work in those breaks, or even just create a habit of pausing in between the calls to re-presence yourself so that you can really be there to be present with people. Because if you aren't, they feel it. Even if they see your face, they see your eyes, looks like you're looking at them. You know, being present with that other person or with your team. You know, visibility is a form of communication, just being visible to people, but being present makes it even more so. I think when I think of visibility, something that I've been doing, because when we're in the office, you can walk around and check in on people. So they see you, right? And they know you're there. And something that I've been doing that isn't a normal behavior when we're in the office is actually jumping into other team meetings. You know, just to kind of check in, see how they're doing, not to take over from the leader that's running the meeting, but just to be present for that team, and you know, let them know that there are other people there that are thinking about them and that are interested in hearing from them. You know, this is a lot about listening too. Like, communication is a lot about listening, and it's easier to listen to people when you're around them. And when we're not, we have to find other ways to listen. So I've been jumping into some of those team meetings just to listen to the conversations that they're having, and to ask them questions and allow them to share what's going on with them, or even to ask questions in the moment. And you know, another act of being vulnerable in leadership is just being there and allowing people to ask questions and get those questions answered. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that idea, and doing it virtually too, because I think that mimics if you work in a traditional office environment, a lot of times those patterns that happen. And it makes me curious of, you know, I have seen a lot of organizations doing, you know, informal Zoom connects, happy hours, coffee breaks, those types of things. And makes me wonder if, you know, sometimes on occasion, just doing an open roundtable with people as another alternative to getting a pulse of what's going on. So I love the idea of jumping into meetings and kind of hearing what's happening and being able to answer questions. But also, like, I haven't heard of people doing this, and maybe they are doing some sort of, you know, roundtable discussion, which is, you know, what's on your mind? What are you excited about? What are you concerned about? Where do you need help? What is causing a level of stress or not? I have one of my clients I work with, she occasionally, I think she's been doing it every couple of weeks, is doing a pulse check with her team, or the team, the bigger team, and having them rate on a scale of 1 to 10, just how they're feeling right now about the organization and how they're feeling about their work. She's asking them both. And people are feeling good about the direction of the organization, but as a general rule, people are not feeling as good about their own work just because they're dealing with some, personal demands and things. So that's enabled her in just a simple way to get a pulse, her to kind of follow up and check in on, what's happening with that individual. So again, creating forums to either make yourself available as a leader as you're doing, jumping in and taking in questions and sharing any additional insights. And then also perhaps, depending on the organization, setting aside time for that conversation specifically, because, that might elicit more needs and from the team. So.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And that's something that we do frequently in team meetings and in one-on-ones, is checking in on people's well-being. And I think that that's important at any time, because everybody's going through something, right? And it's more important now just to check in on where people's mindset is. It also gives us some guidance on what we're not communicating enough, and what we need to be communicating more, making sure we're still casting a strong vision of where we're looking to go in the future, and that we're still going in that direction. And yeah, the path may curve a little bit, or we may choose to shift and be more adaptable to the environment and take a little bit different path, but we still have the confidence in going there and getting there. I really think that's important, and we know how much we need to communicate that if we're listening to people and what their fears are. It just came up for me also in listening. A tool that we use Tiny Pulse. I think David New, the CEO of Tiny Pulse, as do I. And it's an anonymous question that goes out every week. So we're doing face-to-face communication with people. But even still, no matter how much trust you build, sometimes people just don't feel comfortable coming right out with it. And so we have an anonymous question that goes out every week, and we've been tailoring those questions a lot to the current situation to really get a pulse on how people are rating their mental health and well-being. There's a happiness at work question that we ask once a month, and it's important for us to know, like, how are the current situations affecting people. And I think we've got another question going out next week, which is about culture, but it's about responding to this new state of work that we're in and how we can really be supporting the culture during this time. So those are other forms of listening. It's just asking people questions and getting those things in. But the more important thing that we've learned over the years is that you have to communicate back about what you've heard, and you have to take action on those things, or at least explain why you're not taking action. And sometimes we do this really well, and sometimes we don't do it as well. But it builds trust when you respond to those things that you hear, when you say, this is what we're doing about it, or when you say, this is why we're not going to do anything about it. Another form of transparent communication. Well, Christine, we are already at time to wrap up again. And so another coffee conversation with you that flew by at the speed of light. So what parting words do you have for people today?
Don't underestimate the quantity and quality of the communication your team needs from you right now. And, if you're worried that it's too much, you can ask, if it's too much. But at this point in time, back to its transparency, urgency, frequency, and with empathy, as you're going out there and talking with your team.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Christine. And for all of you who are listening today, you can find more resources at adurolife.com/resources, as well as we have a specific COVID-19 page. And we also have a live cast with our coaches on Thursdays at 10. This week, they're going to be talking about finding purpose and meaning during this time. So a great resource for you as leaders, as well as for your teams. So you can find the registration for that also on that resources page online. So thank you for everybody who joined, and thank you for the questions that came in. We want to keep receiving your questions so we can answer those for you. And we will see you next week.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Christine.
Bye.
Bye.